Hello, I'm John Kane, and I welcome you to Let's Talk Native. While this program may not provide a path to spiritual enlightenment, we do encourage and in some cases start conversations. We're shooting for a different kind of enlightenment here, and we kind of break the rules for Native radio. We don't do prayers, we don't do buffalo speeches, and we don't do spirituality shows. We take a tough look at history, oppression, and survival. We talk about the culture, the arts, politics, and identity, and we may step on a few toes along the way. But our real goal here is to bring people together by breaking down what separates us. We will take on the false narratives and provide critical thinking to all that's heaped upon us, and we do it all right here from our LTN studios, live on the Cattaraugus territory of the Seneca Nation. So let's talk Native. Look, I've got a guest joining me tonight. I've got somebody who I haven't actually talked to in a while, Janene Yazzie. She's Dine, so from Navajo Territory, in case you don't know that. She's a human rights and an indigenous rights activist. She is also the co-founder and CEO of Sixth World Solutions, which works on Dine communities to develop projects, programs, and policies that promote sustainability, environmental justice, and self-governance. She has worked on renewable energy development, broadband development, climate change adaptation, and mitigation, and social and economic justice. She is currently serving as the Sustainable Development Coordinator for the International Treaty Council and is the co-vener of the Indigenous Peoples Major Group for Sustainable Development, which engages with the UN High-Level Political Forum on Sustainable Development. And she is also coordinating COVID-19 relief efforts on the ground in Navajo Territory. So let me welcome Janene Yazzie to Let's Talk Native. It is just a pleasure to have you join us.
Thank you so much, John. It's a pleasure to be invited to be on your show.
Well, you know, we did a Left Forum event. Man, it's got to be, is it really like 10 years now?
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, so we did a Left Forum event kind of together. You were on a panel that followed my panel, and that's where we first met. And we've, you know, I've been following a little bit of the work that you've been doing over the years, and I know you've been very, very active. And of course, it's nice if we can just talk about some of the good work that you're doing, and we will. But we also have to talk about the tragedy that is unfolding in Navajo Territory. I mean, this, for those that don't know, and I got to word this the right way, because it's really easy for people to say, well, Navajo Territory stretches across into three states. No, those states try to encroach on Navajo Territory. So they're, three of those states claim Navajo Territory, and those are Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona, and most of Navajo Territory is in that disputed Arizona territory. It is a rather large population compared to most native territories. I don't know, what do the numbers look like for people living on Navajo Territory?
We have over half our enrolled population living on our reservation, so upwards of 150 to 175,000 people.
Yeah, that's what I thought. Those are the numbers I've been saying. So I'm glad you didn't make a liar out of it, because I've talked about this over the past couple of weeks. Now, of course, when I talk about the tragedy that's unfolding, it's the raw numbers from COVID-19, and the fact is that I think as of today, according to Worldometers, there are almost 8,927 confirmed cases of COVID-19 in Navajo Territory, which is a very large number even though 175,000 people is a lot of Native people, in the overall mix for other populations, that's not a big population. And to have almost 9,000 confirmed cases and almost 450 deaths, those numbers make pale many states by comparison, in both in confirmed cases and the number of deaths. I think it's more than like 11 states in terms of number of cases, and more than 16 states in terms of the casualties. And that doesn't fully touch the full ramifications of having such a widespread infection rate on a native territory. Talk to us about. Give me your thoughts just in general as an overview of what's going on in Dine Territory.
Absolutely. I think one of the first points I want to make is that the numbers absolutely do not cover or capture what's actually happening on the ground. One of the best tracking mechanisms that we have is the Navajo Nation Epidemiology Center. And when you like a new feature on their website is a whole disclaimer about the data that they're presenting and the accuracy of it. And it's because of a lot of issues. Like one, the inconsistency with accessing testing, the inconsistency around who can get tested and when, the not including in the data enrolled Navajo Nation members that live in border towns or have addresses off the reservation. And then in the early months of this, when this virus really started to, spread in our communities unabated, we still didn't have all the information that we needed about this virus. And so people were dying in their homes from heart attacks and strokes. And only until 3 months in did people realize that we get enough information to know that that could also be coronavirus related deaths. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to take us a long time to really fully capture all of the information necessary to know how even just our one tribe has truly been impacted by this virus. And like you said, we're not a big population in general. We're one of the largest tribes in the United States. But still, like, because of the rate of the spread and the rate of deaths that are a result of COVID-19, everyone is impacted. These are extended families, clan networks, and vital community members that we're losing to this very devastating health pandemic.
Well, and part of the issue with many native territories is our lifestyles are different, and most people can't fully embrace, especially if you're non-native or if you live in an urban environment. You don't quite appreciate the distinction in the way Native peoples live, and it varies from territory to territory. But here in Seneca Territory, we're suffering from some of the same issues. We we don't have that big a population here. There's only about 4,000 living on Seneca Territory, and out of that 4,000, the infection rate was higher than most. It actually, on a percentage basis, it actually starts to compare a little bit to what's been transpiring in your territory. And we've had 12 deaths out of a population of 4,000. That's still a pretty high number. So, mm-hmm. and as you're saying, there's still a lot of inaccuracy. When we give, again, whether it's Johns Hopkins or Worldometer, they are using numbers that only are confirmed by test. They're by some estimates, there may be 10 times that rate of infection going on. And of course, the mischaracterization of cause of death is significant. You got, on one hand, you've got some people saying, oh, they're labeling everything as COVID deaths, which I don't believe that for a second. I think they're undercounting a lot of it. And of course, this disease exacerbates any other underlying condition, and that underlying condition can also be weather conditions. I mean, extreme heat. Mm-hmm. Other environmental issues that we face. So, and that's a challenge for your territory and your people in general, as it is for many. But you guys, look, you're spread out over a large area. So sometimes providing the resources to communities, and especially some of the more remote communities that you kind of mentioned a little while ago, that becomes difficult, especially when you talk about resources in terms of healthcare. So, I mean, and look, this was all the story in the news a month ago, and now all of a sudden it's dropped from sight, and people are kind of ignoring, well, so where is it now? And it hasn't abated yet. So give me a little bit of your overview on the challenges of healthcare in general, but as it relates specifically to COVID-19.
Absolutely. I think this is a very important question that we try to stress with a lot of people, especially when we were in the national spotlight, because we're often confronted by journalists who kept asking us, like, oh my God, why is your nation being hit so bad? And I was just like, well, if you're paying attention at any point in the history of this country, you'd realize that there was huge injustices and systemic issues that already created and manufactured health pandemics and genocidal conditions prior to COVID ever reaching our territories.
Sure.
And so the barriers and the challenges that are created from having a 30 to 40% population that doesn't have electricity or running water, the enormous digital divide affecting over 70% of our land base, the fact that there are only 13 grocery stores and 8 Indian healthcare service units servicing our entire nation. Like we were sitting ducks. We were sitting ducks.
And some of those have very limited hours, from what I understand, because of the staffing, right?
Yeah, very limited hours, high turnover rate, highly and criminally under-resourced for years prior to this pandemic. And then when the rest of the country was grappling with the hot spots in Seattle and Washington and other places, we still did not have access to testing in our hospitals. And so when the story broke about the first case in the Navajo Nation, which, was brought over through evangelical, I forget what they're called, revival services that where a non-native off-reservation priest or pastor, whatever they're called, came into our territories and infected entire congregations within a small community cluster, those people could not even get tested at their local hospital facility.
And from what I understand, it wasn't just a church service. This was bringing in congregations from all over the territory. So it was an absolute super spreader event that is tied to this notion of group worship, a religion that is not our own. And I'll say that. I know some people might take offense to it. But, and of course, one of the things that I find really disturbing, and I'm going to mention it now just because you brought it up, is when I see a Billy Graham revival or evangelical bus showing up on your territory, and I don't know what they were offering for help, but, there's just something about thoughts and prayers that only go so far. And so when I see this, and I know a lot of people reacted to this, and I was one of them. I said, "Wait a second, that's how this thing got started there in the first place." And so they've the nerve to show up as if they're going to bring some sort of religious relief to a territory that basically became infected because of this. Again, some of this evangelical outreach on a native territory. I find that disturbing.
Mm-hmm. No, it is disturbing, and for me, it's infuriating because here you have our Navajo Nation leadership extending this branch of cooperation and partnership with Billy Graham and his group, knowing full well how this started, knowing full well that they've made their own mistakes administratively in the early onset of this virus by allowing church services special permits to continue when at the critical point when we needed to stop critical community spread, when we needed to give people adequate information, and throughout the course of this administration has been hostile towards indigenous-led mutual aid efforts on the ground, and we've had to struggle and create the infrastructure to provide relief to our most vulnerable community members, while also navigating the very barriers and challenges created by our own government that did not recognize humanitarian relief as an essential service, and subjected our volunteers who were bringing these life-saving resources to families without electricity, families without water, families who lost their sole source of income and who were locked down and forced to stay in place for 57-hour-long weekends with no food or water for a household of sometimes 10 to 15 people, most of those children. And yet you see them, gallivanting on all of these media services about this partnership they have with Billy Graham and his group. It was a slap in the face, especially since in the midst of this and CARES Act negotiations, our own Hatatlis, our own medicine keepers, our traditional knowledge holders, who are not only most at risk in terms of contracting this virus or severe forms of this virus, but who are also most critical for the spiritual, mental, and physical well-being of our peoples, who have the knowledge to help us weather this pandemic because they've been given those medicines, those ceremonies, those lessons, those teachings from previous pandemics that our communities have had to weather. We're outright denied any assistance from the CARES Act allocation and to do their life-saving work and to protect themselves and their groups, because we only have 300 traditional knowledge holders left in our communities. And so that really shows both the huge disconnect of this administration from what's actually necessary and needed on the ground in support of our people who are stepping up to provide the social nets, the safety nets, the resources, the PPE, everything that our communities need to stay safe, and how they've allowed themselves to be co-opted by a religious agenda and their response to this pandemic, when we should not be even having this type of divide, or this type of haphazard responses, and how our own tribal government responds to the needs of the people on the ground.
Well, and look, I understand that there's bound to be some diverse thought and political ideology and that kind of stuff, but it just seems like there's always seems to be a bit of a disconnect between Navajo governance and what the people are experiencing, and whether it's offering code talkers for a name for a replacement name for the Washington football team, or whether it's posing for pictures with Donald Trump or whatever else. It just seems like there's invariably some insane image that comes from some of the elected leadership there. And of course, we also have challenges because as we tried to take some of these issues into our own hand by protecting our territories. We saw this in Lakota territory, but we've seen it in a lot of our territories here where we've tried to limit travel through our territories. We tried to create travel bans and that kind of stuff. We've met resistance from not only oftentimes from tribal leaders, but also from state governing officials and that kind of stuff. So even as we're trying to protect ourselves, we have to fight some of our own people, and of course we have to fight the states. We have to fight the feds. We have to fight them every step of the way, even as we're fighting for our lives.
Absolutely. And it's frustrating. Even in the midst of this, one of the things we always have to let people know is that the threats against our lands, territories, and resources, and the impacts and challenges created by climate change continue unabated. And in many cases, like with the examples that you brought up, like they're actually escalating, and state sanctioned aggression and corporate led attacks on our lands, territories, and resources to promote very harmful sources of development, or forms of development. I mean, in the midst of all of this, we still had to deal with issues of promoting uranium mining in the Grand Canyon. We still had to deal with issues with the National Regulatory Association, Nuclear Regulatory Association, trying to push through plans for creating another nuclear waste repository in New Mexico with Holtec. And so, like, we're not even allowed to just focus.
Coal,
safe.
Coal is still an industry that the Navajo Nation promotes and extracts revenue from.
One of the things that was brought up in all of this discussion about the CARES Act, there was a lot of people very, very smart, very politically aware Navajo Nation citizens who were pointing out that, we had years to deal with a transition plan and create a funding mechanism and plans for how to use revenue from the coal to support more sustainable economies when it came to the closure of the Navajo generating station. And we still haven't made progress on that. So how do we expect our tribes to make progress in allocating and fully expending a $700 million budget in a matter of 6 months? And, it's shown right. And I feel a lot for our elected leaders. I know a lot of them, and I know a lot of them are doing their best in the circumstances that we're operating in. But our tribal leadership is a legacy of colonial control of our lands, our peoples, and our communities. And so there are going to be limitations with what they can and cannot do, and how they can and cannot make these plans and expend these funds that are deeply rooted. And the way that the federal government has always tried to puppeteer and exploit our tribal governance systems for their own ends. And so it's an enormous challenge to try to think about how do we then use these resources that are suddenly made available by the federal government to address issues that they created through their own design over generations of just colonial rule and asserting a definition of sovereignty that is that is defined as domestic dependent nationhood. And so, like the challenges were great, but I think that's what made it even more critical for this administration to use this time and this resources to partner with the people on the ground. All of the people who've stood up and created mutual aid efforts across our nation to bring adequate education, to bring language-based medical material to communities, to bring resources, homemade masks, reusable PPE, food, water, electricity to people who need it most in order to help them stay safe, and to do it in a way that is smart, that allows us to not only respond to this pandemic, but to begin to build the foundation for a more sustainable, self-determined, a social net and governance structure that actually reflects and prioritizes the health and safety of our people above all things.
Well, I've got a video coming out tomorrow. It's I don't know if anybody's done one on the 5 U.S. policies towards Native people. Extermination, removal, assimilation, termination, and self-determination. And as I describe what these policies were and how many of them overlapped or either continue, it's not just something that they weren't just period pieces. These were all geared towards genocide. They were all geared. Assimilation is genocide, and I think people sometimes don't make that connection. But even the last policy that the United States claims is their dominant policy, self-determination. You alluded to it, but it isn't self-determination in the international sense of the word. I know you do work with the UN, and in the international community, self-determination is like statehood. It's like nation state. It's about asserting sovereignty. We both know that if you go through the entire UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the only time the word sovereignty is mentioned is when it's talking about the nation states that are being directed to offer or to maintain this bare minimum level of indigenous rights. There is no talk about ours. And in fact, the reason the United States opposed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, one, they said they were afraid it was going to rewrite international law, but they wanted to be clear, and even their National Security Council, they came through and they said, look, it needs to be clear here that when the United States says self-determination, we don't mean the international definition of self-determination. We mean internal. They can organize amongst themselves. And in fact, they went so far as to say, we don't for a second assert that Native peoples have the right to assert sovereignty over their own land. I mean, and that's coming from the National Security Council. And this was part of the reason they voted against the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in 2007. And this is still the battle that we're facing here today, because this idea of imposing self-governance that they create, that is modeled in their own images, so to speak, and they actually try to suggest that our self-governance is a part of the overall breakdown of U.S. governance, we're just municipalities somewhere in between townships or counties and states, that we are government, U.S. government. Governments ourselves. So there is a complete disconnect, and that's part of the reason we get into this battle. When people talk about things like decolonization, they're talking about finding spaces within the colonial structures to exist, not ridding ourselves, not untangling ourselves and doing some of the very work that you're talking about, where we do restoration of some of we bring our traditions forward. We don't take ourselves backwards, but we bring our traditions forward. And this is the challenge that we all face on the Canadian side. Native people on the Mexican side. We have all these border issues that we're battling all the time. And in the midst of all this stuff, not only do you have this pandemic that strikes our territories very hard, but the ongoing battles that basic things like clean water. Well, part of the challenge is that at least what some of the media grabbed onto was the lack of clean water and available water in Navajo Territory, which actually forces people to come together because there are watering stations. So it's not like everybody's got running water in their homes, and so when we talk about things like, well, we don't have broadband, or we don't have certain luxuries, what some people call luxuries, but are rapidly becoming necessities. Mm-hmm. I don't think people can wrap their heads around the fact that we still struggle with basic necessities like water.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think that one of the things that's missing from a lot of these conversations, like, one, absolutely, people are being denied their true history of colonial expansion and the way colonization has created the development of states, and a lot of the legal frameworks that were still systemically oppressed are underneath. But they also neglect to make the connections with how this is the reality for a lot of rural communities, for a lot of poor communities. And we have waited far too long to come to the realization and see these connections between what has happened with Indigenous peoples in this country, how they've been subjugated systemically and still continue to live under very strong systems of oppression that are enabled by the federal government, but also how those lessons and the crafting of this assimilative, genocidal machine, it also disadvantages immigrant, Black, people of color, and even poor white communities because of the same damn playbook in their communities as well. Like, a lot of these communities don't have water security, they don't have energy security, and they don't realize that it's ultimately because this structure and the system of corporate capitalism that has come to be birthed from these systems of colonialism is fundamentally unsustainable and irreconcilable with the human rights and sustainability needs of all of our communities.
You don't have to have a desert to have a food desert, and you don't have to have a desert to have a healthcare desert. Janene, we're going to take a break here just so I can take a drink and catch my breath here. When we come back, I want to talk about Black Lives Matter, because I absolutely see how we have, in an unlikely manner, become some of the beneficiaries of our voices being heard, not because we had to change the language of Black Lives Matter, but by supporting Black Lives Matter, it made people be aware of the voices that they've been ignoring all this time. So I want to talk about Black Lives Matter when we come back.
That sounds great. Yes, absolutely.
All right. This is John Kane with Janene Yazzie from Dine Territory, and we will be right back after just a brief break here. All right, thanks for coming back. This is John Kane. I've got Janene Yazzie as my guest. But before we get back into it, and we are going to talk about Black Lives Matter and how it has impacted us. But I also want to thank my sponsors. I want to thank Ross and Holly John and the RJE family of businesses. I want to thank Eric White at ERW Enterprises and the good folks at Grand River Enterprises. Look, I also want to thank those of you who help out from time to time. My buddy Ed Schindler, we're trying to buy a couple of new pieces of equipment, replace a soundboard, do some other recording equipment. Got my friend Harry Wallace down with the Poospatuck on the Poospatuck Reservation. Folks like that who step up when we need it. I mean, look, we've got our weekly sponsors and our monthly sponsors, but man, when it comes down to crunch time and we've got to replace some equipment, there are certain people out there who help us do that. And as I say, and I say it proudly, we are entering our 11th year of Let's Talk Native. So I'm, it's been, there were some lean times through there, and we're still struggling. We're dealing with COVID-19 ourselves here in the Cattaraugus Territory of Seneca Nation, but we're trying to keep at it and provide context, provide conversations that we hope you will continue. We aren't trying to be the conversation. We're trying to promote the conversation. So, and again, I'm thrilled to death to have Janene Yazzie from Dine Territory joining me for the program, giving us some insights on what is happening on the ground in Navajo Territory. But I also want to step back a little bit. And I'm sitting here, and you can't necessarily see me, but I'm wearing my I Can't Breathe shirt today because that I Can't Breathe relates both to COVID-19 and obviously Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd. And I've got to say, I know that since the death of George Floyd, I think a lot of people, non-Native people, non-Black people, white people, I mean, all of a sudden said, this is too much, and we better start paying attention. And I'm not saying everybody. Obviously, the right wing of U.S. politics will they'll remain deaf, dumb, and blind. But a lot of people who were almost complicit with their silence, they stopped being silent, and now you've got people being attacked in places like Portland. Very, very white populations are being attacked by federal agents and that kind of stuff. But Janene, I want you to give me your thoughts on how Black Lives Matter helps shine the light. Look, we've had Columbus statues issues. The Washington football team, but I think it is empowered our voices a little bit. So, what are your thoughts?
Absolutely. When I think about this, I think about Standing Rock and how Black Lives Matter advocates showed up and stood in solidarity with our relatives who are defending their sacred water. And in the midst of this pandemic, with what's happened with George Floyd and with everything that was happening in our communities, we had Native youth step up and organize their own Black Lives Matter marches and demonstrations of solidarity, because I just think there's been a wonderful job done by, former generations, former movements, Black Panthers, AIM, Indigenous intellectuals and Black intellectuals around the history of this nation and how our struggles intersect. And on top of that, building relationships. And I myself am married to a beautiful Trinidadian man who has been an extreme asset to my communities, to me, to help carry out the work that is important for our self-determination. And I think that with that, there's been a growing intersectionality rooted in love and critical analysis of the colonial state and the history of these empires, building wealth off of our collective subjugation, off of the genocide of Native peoples, the theft of our lands, territories, and resources, off of the enslavement of our Black brothers and sisters, and off of their continued exploitation and murder by police forces. And so I think that with what has happened and with the conversations within movement spaces about these intersections, we've become stronger by acting together and by really allowing in these movement spaces each other the appropriate space they need to put forward what their claims are. So there's no co-optation of each other's movements. And I think that's the direction we need to continue to go, is stand in solidarity, because none of us are going to be free until we're all free.
I mean, we've seen Columbus statues come down. We've seen conquistador statues come down. Junipero Serra statues come down. I know that our friends, our brothers and sisters, or brother and sisters out in Hawaii are really giving that McKinley statue a hard look every single day. So, I mean, look, and we've all benefited from our voices finally being heard, because it isn't necessarily us that are taking them down. I mean, it's people saying, no, we hear the Native voices. We know what Columbus was all about. Even here, the closest city to me is Buffalo. The Italian Federation, they took the statue down because they were afraid of what we were going to do to it. So we didn't have to take it down. So it's we've experienced this thing, and look, we've done so without having to try to water down Black Lives Matter with All Lives Matter or Native Lives Matter. No, none of us who were really conscious and responsible did that. We still maintained that the Black Lives Movement is the Black Lives Movement, and we don't need to to do some word appropriation of what they've started. And look, I happen to be in New York when people were walking down 7th Avenue after Freddie Gray and that kind of stuff. So, I've had the opportunity in some places. I haven't been back to New York since March. I still do a show in New York on Thursdays. But I do it remotely from my own studio here in Seneca Territory. But no, I see how this goes, and some of the same criticisms that I hear hurled towards Black Lives Matter or any activist who's trying to stand up for black causes, they get the exact same treatment we do. So it's been empowering to see this connection. In fact, you mentioned Black Lives Matter going up to Standing Rock. Ironically, one of the first criticisms I heard is, we didn't see Black Lives Matter up in Standing Rock. And I'm thinking, well, then you just weren't looking, because they were there. I mean,
or you probably weren't there,
or you didn't care enough. I mean, and so you hear people that will hurl totally unsubstantiated, claims out there, and and then when you try to correct them, again, these are the folks on the right. I got to tell you, and I'm not promoting Democrat over Republican. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying that I've seen people who have never really given us the time of day all of a sudden doing it, and some of it does cross over to out to the right side of their political spectrum. But I said this before. There's just a real human moment when an individual has a police officer kneeling on his neck, calling to his mother, asking for his breath, asking for help, and people pleading, bystanders pleading with those cops, telling you're killing him, and again, listening to George Floyd call to his mother, and then seeing the callousness, the absolute absence of any emotion on the faces of those cops. I think it struck people in a way that, for some reason, Tamir Rice couldn't do it. Sandra Bland couldn't do it. Eric Garner couldn't do it. I mean, it's like, it's not even so much that this was the straw that broke the camel's back. It's almost like it just enabled the veil to be pulled back on some people who maybe were just too uncomfortable to look at it before. And now, because of social media, because of the attention this got, I think it forced people to look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the other advantages coming out from this moment and sort of this, whatever this threshold was that was crossed, is the recognition that we all have responsibility to deeply reflect and do that internal work to recognize and get rid of anti-Blackness sentiments and conditioning and biases, to understand and learn about the true history of colonization and Native American genocide and ongoing assimilative policies and how that's created the conditions of third world countries in Native communities, and to learn about how we are all part and have become cogs in this corporate capitalist machine posing as a democracy, and it's time for us to wake up, because we don't have time anymore to pretend that our struggles and our shared visions of liberation and of freedom aren't connected. And I think that, we're experiencing a very, very troubling moment with the rise in fascism and white supremacy and the desperation of these state forces trying to use violence and militarize police forces in order to quell protests and people going to the streets to show that solidarity physically. But we're also living in a very exciting moment, an exciting moment of important transitions, of important learnings and reflections, and a lot of important work that we need to do at the individual level to ensure that we are continuing to educate ourselves, or uneducate in many cases, in order to become part of the collective solution and no longer hold these biases and assumptions, or try to, I forget what the word is, try to engage in oppression Olympics. But really do work together for the type of future that our children deserve.
Yeah. Well, and again, I feel like we have to address some of the religious oppression. And look, when I hear, there's a guy, who claims to be running for president and claims Navajo ancestry. And he literally uses the doctrine of Christian discovery. And he's a Calvinist, which is, one of the more aggressive and oppressive Christian denominations that Native people, Hawaiian people, others have experienced. But he uses the doctrine of Christian discovery as an argument for assimilation, not decolonization, not the idea that we should expose what the doctrine of Christian discovery is to assert our free and independent existence. No, he uses it as some sort of, strange twist to promote Calvinism and to promote his own, we are the people kind of thing. And because we don't adequately confront what some of these systems of oppression, and religion is one of those systems of oppression. It always has been, and it still is. And I know it's tough because in our territories and many other people who have experienced colonialism, much of the Hispanic population, much of the Black population, this is something. Religion is one of those places that becomes a real awkward and a place that people want to stay away from. And I got to tell you, and it's not just because Navajo Territory became had its first super spreader event tied to evangelicals, but the whole idea that anybody would suggest that some of this is God's will. And that we are somehow have to just ride this out and to see if we have sought enough favor from God. I'm just troubled by that. And of course it fits in with the evangelical right and some of what look, there are still people and Mike Pence and Donald Trump, they will still suggest that whatever Native people went through, it was worth it because we were civilized and we were baptized or some other damn thing. And so I'm sorry, I don't want to hijack the whole conversation, but I just feel like it's necessary.
You're hitting it you're hitting the nail on the head, because you don't have to be white to uphold and promote white supremacy, and criticizing and bringing out a critical analysis of religion as an institution does not also equate, and I feel this is the harmful framing in Native communities in particular, like criticizing the institution of religion does not equate criticizing the sacred or criticizing spirituality. There's a political agenda that is historically and through so much research and so much data been documented throughout generations, and how religious institutions were brought to our nations to continue to the assimilation and genocidal project. They were actually the first arms of the government to carry this out into our territories. And this is true in every community and population that has been subjugated by colonial rule. Like unless your church, unless your religion is showing, Jesus as the black man that he was, and telling the story of him being killed by state-sanctioned violence for opposing the oppressive government forces, like your religion is serving white supremacy, and it's serving a narrative to uphold the status quo, which does not serve you or your communities. And it needs to be said. It's a sickness. It's been equated as a way to for people to carry out internalized colonization and lateral oppression in our own communities. And until we can get over this barrier, we will continue to find ourselves in conflicts where, like I said earlier in the show, where we have a tribal administration that is extending olive branches and welcoming with open arms evangelical groups to come in and help save our people, while villainizing and actually delegitimizing grassroots-led, native-led efforts from people in their own communities trying to help their relatives and their clan relations. Yeah. And obviously that's not sustainable.
Well, and I think it's got to be pointed out that, the view that the Christian nations of Europe and indeed the United States through much of its existence, the view that they had towards Native people is that we were less than human. And in fact, there are politician after politician that talked about us joining the human race. like we weren't there already. We had to join the human race, and if we didn't, then we had to be destroyed. And of course, now you look in your frame things like the residential schools, which I still maintain it was a breeding ground for what is now considered the clergy sex abuse scandals that plague not just the Catholic Church, but many of the other churches. But when you look at what was done to our kids, not just the assimilation, and that all by itself is a war crime, but the physical abuse, the sexual abuse, the psychological abuse, the sterilization programs, the idea of letting, I mean, people talk about what happened with the Tuskegee experiments and letting injecting syphilis into black men to watch it, what would happen as it progressed. Well, the same thing was happening with Native kids when it came to tuberculosis. There was no effort to quarantine. They just let it spread. And at some times, some of the periods of time, both on the U.S. and the Canadian side, there was a 50% mortality rate for residents of these residential schools. So, I don't want to sound like I'm unnecessarily beating anybody up, but this is a part of the truth that has to be exposed. And when you put it into those contexts, it certainly does make you view a Billy Graham motorhome showing up that's going to somehow save you spiritually.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It felt like a punch to the gut, to tell you the truth, because I've been mobilizing with great, amazing people who've literally built mutual aid efforts from scratch, and have personally seen the stress and the struggle of our volunteers trying to work within mandated curfew hours because we weren't given a waiver as essential workers by our government, so to be free to work outside curfew hours. And then to see our young people having to face all of these challenges just to serve their communities, and then have this red carpet rolled out for these evangelical Christian groups to come in and save our people without the type of love, care, compassion, critical analysis of the needs that our people need, and investment and long-term recovery.
And let's not forget that
these
church organizations are wealthy beyond most people can imagine, and Billy Graham's crusades are among the most enriched evangelical organizations there are. So rather than providing resources, they come in with their glitzy bus so they can have photo ops with the president of the Navajo Nation. You're right. It's not just a punch. It's not just a punch in the gut to you. It's a punch in the gut to all of us, because this is the kind of stuff that we see over and over and over again. So I'm glad. I got to admit, sometimes this is a difficult subject to broach with some people, because some people have been this. They don't even view the religious indoctrination as part of the colonization effort, and of course I knew better with you, but I'm glad we could have this frank conversation on the show.
Absolutely. It's well overdue, and it needs to happen more and more often in these public conversations around the situation that we're dealing with when it comes to systemic oppression and inequality, because these two have been, the state and religion have been tied together in the colonial project since the founding of this nation.
Well, and to talk about this stuff is not, I'm not even talking reparations. I'm talking about our right to a free and independent existence. And the reason for exposing the doctrine of Christian discovery isn't so what we can be embraced, to conform with, American colonialism or American imperialism or with, the spread of Christendom. No, it's about saying, here's the reason that the very act of imposing this doctrine of Christian discovery on us is the very reason we maintain that much of the laws that have been found, that are foundational to that, and a lot of it is everything from jurisdictional issues to land use issues, land title issues. I mean, look, many of our territories, we hold our lands a little differently out here, but many of the lands, native lands, are lands that we don't actually hold the title to. The federal government does. They hold it as trust lands for our Native people, for our free use and enjoyment. And that's held over our heads. And all of that idea that the United States could hold our land title for us is foundational in the doctrine of Christian discovery. And these are the things that people don't want to connect the dots. I got to give credit. When the Yakima, that company up in Yakima Territory was fighting the taxation issue over him delivering fuel oil, the Yakima Nation submitted amicus briefs there, and it was a two-part. And the first part was all about laying out the invalidity of the doctrine of Christian discovery. The second part had to do with treaty issues. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court didn't even touch the doctrine of Christian discovery portion of their amicus brief. And they did ultimately rule. In fact, Neil Gorsuch was the deciding vote that supported the ruling that helped out this Yakima fuel vendor. But I'm glad to see that there are those of us in various places that are walking the walk, and we're talking the talk, and we're not afraid to address just because these are long-standing precedents that were established. If you take a look at them and you really hold it up even to their constitutional lens, you realize that it's invalid. And of course, the doctrine of Christian discovery in the third affirmation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the third affirmation of that clearly lays out that any superiority that is promoted by racism or religion or nation of origin, that it's legally invalid, morally condemnable, socially unjust, scientifically false, and they go on. So I think we need to make sure that part of that language is with us all the time. Every time we're confronted with these jurisdictional battles and with these land use battles, that we stand up and say, no, well, your whole foundation for making these claims is legally invalid.
Absolutely. I am like 100% in on that strategy. I've been seeing like interesting memes. It's kind of how I get like half of my news. But I've been seeing interesting memes where people are talking about, like the legal system and like how like slavery was legal, child exploitation was legal, like all these horrible things used to be legal. So legality shouldn't be the moral compass over how we address things. And like one of the things that always strikes me is that embedded into our legal systems is the swearing of the oath on the Bible and to God, right?
Teaching little kids to pledge allegiance to the flag and that kind of stuff. All of that, right?
Yeah, and we're still living in a country where it's still legal not only to take away lands from indigenous peoples, but to actually take away your ability to self-identify as your nation. And like that's what we saw with the Wampanoag Nation. Yep. Not only the erasure of the land, but then what connected to that is the erasure of identity affiliation, and that's a genocidal act being carried out by this administration in 2020.
One of the craziest parts about the Wampanoag issue is that in order for them to make their case for doing a fee to trust application, they had to provide sufficient information and proof to the federal government that they were under U.S. jurisdiction in 1934. And this is one of these bizarre, in what world do you say, in order for us to get our land back, we've got to say that we were subjugated, not today, not yesterday, but in 1934? It's one of these most bizarre things that exist, but you're absolutely right to bring it up.
Yeah, no, it's ridiculous. We have so many experience working just in the area of land and earth restoration and community healing.
Yep.
And coming up with systemic barriers that render that nearly impossible because of outdated, archaic legal frameworks and definitions that never reflected justly or truly the reality of the ground and our people's connection, existence, and inherent rights to be and live as human beings on this earth. And
Janene, you have got to join me again, and the next time we'll talk about the good work that you're doing, not just all of this stuff that we're experiencing right now. And when things ever relax enough that I go back to New York, or you go back to New York, perhaps part of some of the UN work that you're doing, perhaps we can get together and you can join me on my New York show as well, and we can get a chance to have coffee or something someplace. I'd look forward to that.
I would love that.
Well, thank you so much for joining me here, and I will ask you to come back if you've got something that's coming up that you want to promote. I'd be happy to assist you with that and have you join me on my program to do that. So let's plan to regroup and catch back up soon.
Absolutely. That sounds great. Thank you so much.
All right. And I want to thank all of you for listening. Great program. But if you watch this show, if you've heard this show, please share it. This was a good program, a great guest, and again, I can't say enough about what a pleasure it was to have Janene join me for the hour. And this hour flew by. So we'll do another one. Look, we're gonna do our New York show on Thursday at 3:00, and we'll airing live on WBAI in New York City. So we'll see you back here on Thursday and do it again. This is John Kane. This is Let's Talk Native. Yahweh.
Rivers run dry, dust breaths in the air.